The Hartwell estate had a particular kind of silence in the early hours, the kind that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. 47 rooms, 12 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, and a swimming pool that nobody had used in 2 years. The silence had weight. It pressed down on the marble floors and the cathedral ceilings and settled into the corners of rooms where laughter was supposed to live but didn't anymore. Ethan Hartwell had built his empire on numbers, on algorithms and acquisitions, on balance sheets that stretched across 3 continents, and a tech portfolio that Forbes had called quietly unstoppable in last January's issue. He was 33 years old and had more money than 3 generations of his family could spend, and on most mornings, he sat alone at the breakfast counter of kitchen number 1. He never bothered to name them anything more creative, with a black coffee going cold beside him while he stared at spreadsheets on his laptop and felt absolutely nothing. That particular Tuesday in April, he was running through Q2 projections when he heard it. It wasn't a crash or a scream or anything that should have pulled a man like him away from 8-figure decisions. It was a giggle, high-pitched and utterly shameless. The kind of sound that doesn't know what dignity is and wouldn't care even if someone explained it. A child's giggle, bubbling up from somewhere down the East Corridor like something escaped from a world where everything was still simple. Ethan set down his coffee. He told himself he was going to check whether one of the cleaning staff had brought an unauthorized visitor into the house. That was the professional reason, the logical reason. The reason that fit inside the neat architecture of the life he'd constructed since his mother died 18 months ago and left him truly, completely alone in this enormous house. He followed the sound through the corridor past the portrait gallery, past the room his mother had used as a reading room that he hadn't entered since the funeral, and through the arched doorway that led to the sunroom, a space that faced east and flooded with gold every morning, another room he never used. And there she was, a little girl, no older than 3, standing in a patch of morning sunlight, so perfect it looked staged. She was wearing tiny overalls, pale yellow with a strawberry embroidered on the chest pocket, and white sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, because someone had done their best with limited time and a wiggly child. In her right hand, she clutched a cherry lollipop on a white stick, and she was swinging it, not eating it, just swinging it, in wide, lazy arcs in front of her, watching the way the red light scattered when the sunlight hit it. She was completely absorbed, completely enchanted, by a lollipop, by the light. Ethan stood in the doorway and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something uncomfortably close to wonder. "Ellie." The voice came from the left, urgent and hushed, the specific voice of someone trying to be quiet while also being panicked. "Ellie, baby, come here. Come to Mama right now, please." The woman appeared from behind the large sectional sofa where she'd clearly been cleaning the baseboards, on her knees, a cloth in her hand, her dark hair escaping its bun in pieces. She was wearing the standard gray uniform the household staff wore, but it sat on her differently than it did on most. She moved with a kind of grace that didn't match the frantic expression on her face as she scooped toward her daughter. She hadn't seen him yet. Ethan watched her scoop the little girl up, pressing a kiss to her temple that was so automatic, so unconsciously tender, that he felt like he was witnessing something private. The little girl, Ellie, protested with a squirm and held her lollipop up to show her mother, as if offering evidence of an important discovery. "Son," the child said, pointing at the window with her sticky lollipop hand. "Mama." "Sun makes it sparkle." "I know, baby. I know it does." The woman's voice softened completely, that automatic maternal alchemy that turns panic into tenderness in a single breath. "But we can't be in here. This isn't our room." "None of this is your room," Ethan heard himself say. "But you can stay." The woman turned. She was 28 years old, though he didn't know that yet. She had dark eyes that, in the morning light, held gold the same way the lollipop had. She had the kind of face that looked like it had learned to be careful, composed, watchful, but it had been caught off guard now, and what he saw underneath the composure was exhaustion and pride and love, all running together. Mr. Hartwell. Her voice was steady even if her expression wasn't. She shifted her daughter higher on her hip and lifted her chin slightly. I'm so sorry. My babysitter canceled this morning, and I had no one to call. It won't happen again. I can take her to my car. It's fine, he said, and he was slightly surprised to discover he meant it. I said you can stay. I have work to finish. Then finish it. She's not bothering anything. He paused, watching the little girl, who had turned her solemn, curious gaze on him with the fearless assessment that only very small children can manage. She's just looking at the light. The little girl, still watching him, lifted the lollipop slowly and held it out toward him. An offering. The most generous gesture she knew. Something in Ethan Hartwell's chest cracked open like a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. Fresh air poured in, and it hurt the way fresh air always hurts when you've been breathing something stale for long enough to forget what you were missing. That's Ellie, the woman said, her voice softer now. And I'm Sophia. I've been on the team for 3 months, so we haven't. You've been traveling, so you haven't, she stopped.
Took a breath. I'm sorry.
I'll keep her out of the rooms you use. Ethan, he said. She blinked. I'm sorry. My name. It's Ethan. He wasn't sure why he said it. He never told the household staff to call him by his first name. There were 17 people who worked in and around this house, and not one of them called him anything but Mr. Hartwell. He had thought he preferred it that way. He had thought a lot of things about what he preferred that were beginning, suddenly, to feel uncertain. Ellie was still holding out the lollipop. He crossed the sunroom slowly, crouching down to her eye level the way you do when you want a small person to know you're taking them seriously, and he looked at the cherry lollipop, sticky, slightly lint-dusted, obviously already licked, and he thought about the last time someone had offered him something with that kind of uncomplicated generosity. He couldn't remember. Thank you, he told her. He didn't take it. It wasn't really about taking it. It's a good one. Ellie smiled at him. Big, gap-toothed, and completely without condition. He was, from that moment, entirely lost. Sophia Reyes had learned early that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who saw her and those who looked through her. In the 7 years since she'd immigrated to the United States from a small city in Mexico with her mother's blessing and $40 in her pocket, she had become very skilled at reading which category a person fell into within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. Most wealthy employers looked through her. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something more like habit, the trained blindness that comes from a lifetime of being surrounded by people who are paid to be invisible, and eventually your eyes begin to cooperate. She had worked in 4 wealthy homes before the Hartwell estate, and in each of them she had been efficient, professional, invisible. She had told herself this was fine. Invisible was safe. Invisible kept her paycheck steady, which kept Ellie's daycare paid, which kept the world turning. The Hartwell estate paid better than anywhere else she'd worked. Enough that she'd been able to move from a room she rented in a shared apartment into a small studio of her own, hers and Ellie's, 15 minutes from the estate. Enough that she'd been able to put a little aside each month in the coffee tin she kept on the highest shelf in the kitchen, the one Ellie couldn't reach yet. The tin was for the future. Sophia had vague, precious plans for the future, a community college certificate in early childhood education, maybe eventually a small daycare of her own. Something with her name on it. Something nobody could take away. She didn't let herself dream about it too hard. Dreaming too hard about things had a way of making their absence unbearable, and Sophia Reyes did not have the luxury of unbearable. She had a 3-year-old daughter who needed her to be sturdy. Ellie had been an accident and a miracle in the same breath, conceived in the final months of a relationship with a man who'd been charming and then absent, and finally, when Sophia told him about the pregnancy, so thoroughly absent that he might as well have never existed. She didn't spend energy being bitter about it. Energy was a resource she budgeted like money, and bitterness had a terrible return on investment. Ellie was 3 now, and she was, Sophia thought this without apology, extraordinary. She was curious in the way only very young children are, before the world teaches them that curiosity is sometimes inconvenient. She asked why about everything. Why the sky was blue, why dogs had tails, why pasta got soft when you put it in hot water, why some people had sad eyes. She collected small things that caught the light, bottle caps, a piece of sea glass Sophia had brought home once from a work trip to a coastal property, a silver button, a foiled chocolate wrapper. She kept them in a shoebox under her little bed in their studio apartment and visited them the way other people visit loved ones. She had gotten the lollipop from Mrs. Castellano, the elderly woman who lived in the apartment below theirs and who pressed candy into Ellie's hands every time she saw her with the urgency of someone who understood exactly how sweet small pleasures were. The babysitter had canceled at 6:15 that Tuesday morning. A text, 2 words, "so sorry," and Sophia had stood in her kitchen holding her phone and doing the math. The backup babysitter wasn't available. Her neighbor across the hall was already at work. Her mother was 3,000 miles away. Her options were bring Ellie or lose the day's pay, and losing the day's pay was not an option. So she'd brought Ellie with the promise of the lollipop as a bribe for good behavior, packed a small bag of quiet activities, a coloring book, 3 crayons, a stuffed rabbit named Bun, and told herself she'd keep Ellie in the service areas, nowhere near the rooms Mr. Hartwell used, and everything would be fine. Everything had been fine until it wasn't. Until the sunroom with its extraordinary morning light had drawn Ellie in like a small moth to a very expensive flame. She thought about that first morning over and over in the days that followed. About the way Ethan Hartwell, Ethan, he'd said, and the word had sat strangely in her mouth all the way home, had crouched down to her daughter's level. About the care in it. The deliberateness. She'd worked for men with far more patience than they deserved, who couldn't have been bothered to acknowledge a child's existence, who would have called the house manager and had the situation handled without ever looking up from their phones. But he had crouched down. He had looked at the lollipop like it mattered. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Told herself she was constructing a narrative out of a single gesture because she was lonely and tired, and sometimes the mind, when it's running low on hope, starts finding it in places where it probably doesn't belong. She was very logical about it. The logic started to wobble on Thursday, when she arrived in the morning to find a small white bag on the kitchen counter with her name on it in handwriting that was careful but unused to being careful, someone who didn't write by hand often. Inside, 3 cherry lollipops and a note that said, simply for Ellie, in case she runs out of sun catchers. Sophia stood in that kitchen alone for a full 2 minutes, holding the bag, doing absolutely nothing. Then she folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket and began her work. She was logical. She was careful. She had rules she lived by, built from scar tissue and hard-won wisdom, and the most important rule was this: a maid and a billionaire occupied different universes that sometimes briefly orbited close to each other, and the kindest thing, the safest thing, was to remember that proximity was not the same as belonging. She believed this completely. She repeated it to herself on Thursday evening while Ellie carefully arranged the 3 cherry lollipops in her treasure box alongside the sea glass and the silver button, her face illuminated with the specific joy of someone who cannot yet comprehend that some gifts are complicated. "Pretty," Ellie announced. "They are so pretty, Mama." "Yes, baby," Sophia said, and her voice was even and calm. "They are." She was very good at keeping her voice even and calm. She'd had a lot of practice. What she wasn't good at, what 3 years of solo parenthood and guarded living had not managed to train out of her, was the feeling that hit her chest when her daughter looked up from that treasure box with her father's nose and her grandmother's eyes and Sophia's own stubborn little chin, and smiled. That feeling wasn't logical, and it wasn't careful, and it ignored every rule she'd ever made for herself. It felt like being seen. It felt like matching. It felt like the sunlight in that sunroom, landing on a child's lollipop, making something ordinary into something that sparkled. And for the first time in a long time, Sophia Reyes was afraid. Not of losing something, but of beginning, against every careful instinct she'd ever cultivated, to want something she hadn't let herself want. It started with coffee, the way most things that unravel careful people do. Ethan had a habit he'd built over years of solitary living. He made too much coffee. His machine brewed a full carafe every morning by default, and every morning he drank 1 cup, and the rest went cold, and eventually got thrown away. He never adjusted the setting because adjusting the setting would have required him to notice the waste, and noticing the waste would have required him to reckon with the solitude, and reckoning with the solitude had always felt like a door he wasn't ready to open. On the Friday after the sunroom incident, he came down to kitchen number 1 at his usual 7 o'clock and found Sophia already there, wiping down the counters with her back to him, Ellie installed on the floor nearby with her coloring book and her rabbit, Bun, propped against the cabinet with the solemn authority of a stuffed animal who has important opinions about the color choices being made. Ethan stopped in the doorway. Sophia startled when she turned around. "I can work somewhere else," she said immediately, the reflexive apology of someone who has been made to feel like an inconvenience often enough that the apology has become automatic. "I was just finishing up before you. Do you drink coffee?" he said. A pause. "Mister?"
Ethan.
Another pause. Longer. He watched her decide something. "Yes," she said carefully. "I do. I make too much. Every morning." He moved to the counter, poured 2 mugs with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has decided to do a thing and is not going to make it strange by overthinking it. He held one out to her. "It's not a big deal. It's just coffee." She looked at the mug, then at him, then at the mug again. He could see her rules running behind her eyes like a calculation, the careful arithmetic of a woman who had learned that small acceptances could lead to large complications. "Thank you," she said and took it. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, and it was awkward for approximately 45 seconds, and then Ellie looked up from her coloring book and held it up for general approval.
"Bear," she announced.
She had colored the bear purple. The grass was orange. The sky was green. "That bear is excellent," Ethan said. Ellie considered him. "Do you like purple?" "I do now." This appeared to satisfy her. She returned to her coloring with the decisive air of someone who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Ethan looked at Sophia across the counter. Sophia was hiding a smile behind her coffee mug, and something about the hiddenness of it, the way she was trying to contain it, made him want to see the whole of it. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "The work. With houses like this."
7 years, she said.
"Since I came to the U.S. She said it straightforwardly, no apology for the history in it. "Do you like it?" The question surprised her.
He could see it.
She thought for a moment before she answered, which he respected, the refusal to give him the easy automatic answer. "I like being in people's houses," she said finally. "You learn things about people from the way they keep their space. Or don't keep it." She hesitated. No offense. He looked around at the kitchen, the full-size professional appliances that had been used to make exactly one thing, coffee, since the last caterer left. None taken. I don't like feeling like furniture, she said, and then immediately looked like she wished she hadn't said it.
I'm sorry.
That was.
No.
He shook his head. Don't apologize for that. You're right to say it. He looked at his coffee. I've probably been guilty of it. She didn't deny it or comfort him about it. He appreciated that more than she knew. What would you rather be doing, he asked, if not this? Now the smile she'd been hiding came out, not full, but present. Complicated and warm at the same time.
Working with children, she said.
I want to get my early childhood certification eventually.
Have my own place someday.
Something small. You'd be good at it. You've known me 4 days. 4 days, and I've watched you with her. He nodded toward Ellie, who had added a yellow sun to her green sky and appeared pleased with the result. That's enough. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, trying to determine whether the ground ahead would hold their weight. Ethan had lived in uncomfortable silence for so long that he'd stopped being able to tell the difference between kinds. But this was different. This silence had texture. It had the quality of two people deciding, separately and simultaneously, to be a little bit brave. She has her father's nose, Ethan said, because he wanted to know, but he said it gently, leaving every possible door open. He's not in the picture, Sophia said. Not with bitterness. With a kind of matter-of-fact steadiness that comes after you've accepted something difficult and built your life around the acceptance. It's just us. Just you, he said, has done pretty well. She looked at him for a long moment with those careful gold-flecked eyes, and he saw something shift in them. Not open, not yet, but less closed. The way a window looks when someone on the other side has touched the latch. It's hard sometimes, she said, and it sounded like a confession. Like the sentence had been waiting a long time to come out. I know about hard sometimes, he said. Different kind. But I know. Ellie abandoned her coloring and climbed to her feet, toddling across the kitchen to deposit herself against her mother's leg. Sophia's hand went to her daughter's head automatically, fingers threading through the disheveled pigtails, and Ellie looked up at Ethan with the cherry lollipop from Wednesday's bag in her hand. She'd apparently been holding it this whole time, secret in her small fist. She held it up to him. He'd been offered this gift before. He understood now that it was her highest form of welcome. You keep it, he said softly. It's yours. But Ellie shook her head with the certainty of a child who has made a decision and is not interested in negotiating. You hold it, she said. Just hold it. He reached out and took the lollipop. Held it. Let the small weight of it sit in his palm, sticky and warm from her grip and impossibly light. He stood in his enormous kitchen, in his enormous house full of its held-breath silence, holding a cherry lollipop belonging to a 3-year-old girl in pigtails who had decided, for reasons known only to herself, that he was trustworthy. And the silence in that house changed its nature, right then. It stopped being a held breath. It started being space. Space that was waiting patiently to be filled. The third week was when things became impossible to organize into neat categories. It wasn't any single moment. It was an accumulation, small things stacking up the way snow does, each flake negligible on its own, until one morning you look out the window and the whole world has changed its shape. Ethan had always been good at identifying the moment a situation shifted. It was what made him an excellent businessman, the ability to read inflection points before they became obvious. But with this, he kept missing it. Kept thinking not yet, and then looking up to find that yet had already arrived and installed itself quietly while he was looking elsewhere. He started coming down earlier in the mornings. He told himself it was a change in routine, good for him, nothing more. He started making sure the kitchen was stocked with things a 3-year-old would eat, citing the general impracticality of having staff come in with hungry children and nothing suitable in the house. He asked Sophia, with studied casualness, what days the regular babysitter was unreliable so that he could plan accordingly. For what, exactly, he didn't examine too closely. Sophia, for her part, was fighting a battle with herself that she was slowly and definitively losing. She watched him with Ellie and tried to file it away as employer being kind to employee's child because that was the appropriate category, the sensible category, the one that kept everything safe and legible. But Ethan Hartwell with Ellie was not a thing that stayed in appropriate categories. He sat on the kitchen floor one morning, the floor, in his probably $800 pants, and let her show him every item in the small bag of treasures she'd brought from home, listening to the provenance of each one as though she were presenting artifacts of genuine historical significance. The sea glass, from the ocean, Mama brought it. The button, from a coat that broke. The foil wrapper, from chocolate that was so good. He held each thing carefully, asked questions. The silver button, what kind of coat? A winter one, Ellie said with authority. It was very cold. Sophia, cleaning the windows across the room, had to face the glass for longer than the task required. There was an afternoon, he found her crying in the laundry room. Not dramatically. Sophia did not cry dramatically. She had learned to cry the way she did most things, quietly and efficiently, with minimal disruption to the surrounding environment. She'd received a call from her mother that morning. Her father had been hospitalized. Not critical, the doctor said, but the word hospitalized from 3,000 miles away has a way of making every practical obstacle between you and the person you love feel like a wall. She hadn't heard him come in. She had her back to the door, and she was folding a sheet with great concentration while her face did something she didn't have permission for it to do. Sophia. She turned, and she didn't have time to compose herself. He saw it. All of it. The grief and the fear and the exhaustion, and for a terrible moment she braced for the discomfort, for the polite, awkward withdrawal of a man confronted with an employee's feelings, the professional distance snapping back into place like a rubber band. He didn't step back. What happened? She told him. Shorter than the full story, but truthfully. He listened the way he'd listened to Ellie talk about buttons, fully, without looking for an exit. Go, he said when she'd finished. Go be with Ellie. Call your mother back. Take the rest of the day. I'm fine. I have rooms to finish. Sophia. Just her name. But the way he said it, like it mattered that it was specifically her, not an employee, not a category, but her, undid something she'd been carefully keeping knotted. The rooms don't matter. She didn't cry in front of him, but it was close. That evening, after she'd called her mother and gotten the full update, her father was stable, a cardiac scare, monitored and improving. She sat on the floor of her studio apartment with Ellie in her lap and her back against the sofa, and she let herself think about what her life had looked like 3 weeks ago versus now. 3 weeks ago, this apartment had felt like enough. Small but sufficient. The coffee tin on the shelf and Ellie's treasure box and Bun the Rabbit and the steady work, enough. She was frightened to discover it was beginning to feel less like enough. Not because anything material had changed, but because she'd had 3 weeks of mornings that felt different, of being spoken to like a person rather than a function, of watching her daughter be seen, fully and with delight, by someone who had no obligation to see her at all. She was frightened because she knew what this was. She was 28 years old, and she'd been in love exactly once before, and it had left her with Ellie, and a lesson she'd thought she'd learned permanently, that her heart was not a good judge of character. That warmth could be circumstantial. That people who made you feel visible in easy times were sometimes nowhere to be found when things got hard. She pulled Ellie closer. Ellie, half asleep, reached up and patted Sophia's face with a sticky palm, the way she did sometimes, a check-in, a small reassurance, offered and received without words. "Mama's sad," Ellie murmured. "Mama's okay," Sophia said. "Mama's just thinking." "Think happy things," Ellie advised, and closed her eyes with the serene authority of someone who has offered perfectly sufficient counsel. Sophia pressed her lips to the top of Ellie's head, breathed her in, that particular scent, like warmth itself, like every good thing she'd done in the last 3 years condensed into a smell. Think happy things. In the Hartwell house, the next morning, Ethan stood in the east corridor before his 7 o'clock and looked at the door to the reading room, the one he hadn't opened in 18 months. His mother's books were in there, her reading chair, the small lamp she'd loved because the light was exactly right, she'd always said. "The light is exactly right in this lamp and I will not replace it, Ethan, not for any amount of money." He opened the door. He went in. He sat in the chair. He didn't read anything. He just sat in the chair where his mother had sat, in the room she'd kept, and he let himself understand something he'd been refusing to understand. That the silence in this house hadn't just been the silence of a busy man who preferred quiet. It had been the silence of a man who'd been, in some fundamental way, asleep, keeping himself busy and numb and moving so that he didn't have to feel the exact dimensions of his own loneliness. A 3-year-old with a lollipop had woken him up, and the woman who'd done her daughter's hair in uneven pigtails with the hands of someone running out of time and still found a way to do them, she had walked into the room behind the child and taken up residence in a part of his chest he'd thought was permanently closed. He sat in his mother's chair and thought about proximity and belonging. He thought about how Sophia had held the coffee mug that first morning with both hands around it like it was warm and she needed warmth and she was grateful but not going to show too much of how grateful. He thought about the way she never softened the truth for him. He thought about the note he'd left with the lollipops, in case she runs out of sun catchers. He'd written it at midnight, and it had felt like the most honest thing he'd said in years. He didn't know how to do this, whatever this was. He'd been in relationships before, careful, contained, relationships with women who existed in his world and understood its particular language. None of them had looked at him the way Sophia looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, like she was trying to figure out if he was real. He wanted to be real. He wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in a very long time, and wanting something that much was terrifying in a way that a billion-dollar acquisition had never managed to be. It was a Sunday when Sophia decided to be done with it. Not done with the job, she needed the job, but done with the mornings that felt like more than mornings. Done with reading kindness as something other than what it probably was. The reflexive generosity of a decent, wealthy man who felt slightly sorry for the employee with the difficult life. She had built an entire emotional architecture out of cherry lollipops and one note, and she was 28 years old, and she was not going to be undone by a man who had the luxury of being generous, without consequence. She was very stern with herself about this. She decided she would be professional. She would be efficient. She would stop drinking his morning coffee and stop letting her daughter build castles of attachment around a man who would always live in a world that was categorically different from theirs. She would be the version of herself that had gotten through the first year of solo parenthood, practical, contained, forward-facing. She lasted until approximately 7:14 a.m. Ellie, who had been promised the lollipop after breakfast and was holding it in advance as collateral, dropped it in the corridor between the East Wing and Kitchen Number 1. It rolled with great purpose under the antique credenza that sat against the wall, pushed far, deep, unreachable by small hands. The wail that followed was the sound of genuine 3-year-old tragedy, not spoiled anger, but true grief, the grief of something important being lost. Sophia was on her knees trying to reach the lollipop with a cleaning cloth when Ethan appeared from the study. He took in the situation, Sophia on the floor, Ellie's face tragic, the lollipop visible but unreachable, and crouched down beside them without a word, reached his considerably longer arm beneath the credenza, and produced the lollipop. He held it out to Ellie. She took it with both hands and held it to her chest like a recovered treasure, her face transitioning from tragedy to relief with the liquid speed of very young emotions. "Thank you," Sophia said from the floor, where she was still kneeling. He was still crouching beside her. Their faces were level. Close, the proximity enforced by the low shelf and the narrow corridor, and the general logistics of credenza-related rescue. She could see the gray at his temples, just starting. She could see that he hadn't shaved in a few days and that it suited him in a way she was strictly not going to acknowledge. "Sophia," he said quietly. Ellie had wandered a few steps away, occupied with lollipop rehabilitation. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway," she said, and then felt heat in her face.
Sorry.
It was accurate. He almost smiled. "This morning, yesterday, the past few weeks." He paused, and she watched him choose his next words with the care of someone who understood that certain words, once spoken, change the shape of things permanently. "I'm not very good at this." "At what?" "At saying things I mean, without it sounding like a business proposition." He looked at the floor briefly, and the gesture was so uncharacteristically vulnerable, so unlike the version of this man she'd initially assembled in her head, that her chest ached. "I like mornings now," he said. "I didn't before. I used to. The house was just—"
"It was just a place."
"And now it's—"
He stopped. "Don't," she said.
Her voice was barely steady. "Please don't say things you might not mean." "I don't say things I don't mean. That's the one thing I'm actually reliable about." She looked at him for a long time. Ellie had settled on the floor nearby and was examining her lollipop for damage with the focused attention of a quality inspector. "I am her mother," Sophia said, and it wasn't a warning. It was an offering, the most important piece of information she possessed. "She comes first. She will always come first." "She's not." She swallowed.
"She's not a detail."
"She's the whole thing." "I know," he said simply. "That's not a problem for me." "We are not the same," she said. And she meant the money, the worlds, the architecture of their lives. "We are very different people." "Yes," he agreed. "I think that's why it works." The word works sat in the air between them, past tense constructed as present, framing something still becoming as though it already had shape.
"Ethan."
His name in her mouth for the first time, deliberate, not an accident. She saw it land on him, saw his expression shift into something open and slightly undone. "I've been hurt before. I cannot afford to be hurt again. And I am not talking about money." "I know what you're talking about." "My daughter loves you," she said, and her voice broke, just slightly, on the word loves, broke and recovered in the same breath. "She has given you every piece of treasure she owns, one lollipop at a time. If this is something that goes away." "It won't," he said, and there was nothing performative in it. No charm, no polish. Just the flat, undecorated certainty of a man who had been alone long enough to know, with complete clarity, when he was done being alone. Ellie stood up from the floor, walked over to them, and placed herself firmly between their two crouching bodies, looking from one face to the other with her chocolate dark eyes. Then she held out the lollipop, to both of them, this time equidistant, and offering Maid simultaneously. "Share," she said, with the confident moral authority of a person who learned this at daycare and has since applied it as a universal principle. Sophia laughed. It came out ragged and real, nothing composed about it. The laugh of a woman who has been holding something in for weeks and has finally run out of room to hold it. Ethan laughed too, and it was, she realized, the first time she'd heard him laugh without reservation, without the layer of guardedness most of his smiles had. It was different. It was better. She reached out and took one end of the lollipop stick gently. He reached out and took the other. Ellie beamed at them with the radiant satisfaction of someone who has solved an important problem. And Sophia Reyes, who had built her entire life on being careful, on keeping her world legible and safe and bounded by the walls of what was practical, let herself sit in the corridor of an impossible house, holding one end of a cherry lollipop, and felt the walls come down. 6 months later, the sunroom had furniture in it. Not the designer pieces the estate decorator had long ago arranged for photographs and guest impressions, but real furniture, a child-height table, paint-stained, beside which a small easel held a canvas that was currently orange, purple, and joyfully abstract. Bun the rabbit held court on the windowsill. A shoebox of treasures lived on the lowest shelf of the built-in bookcase, reorganized weekly. The reading room was open too now. Most mornings, before 7, Ethan sat in his mother's chair for 15 minutes. Not to grieve anymore, or not only. To be still. To be present in the house in a way he hadn't been when it had been merely a structure he slept inside. He had begun to understand, slowly and with some astonishment, that his mother had tried to teach him this. That the lamp with the exactly right light had been an instruction in paying attention, in letting beautiful, small things count. He was getting better at it. On a Saturday morning in early October, the house had a different kind of sound in it. It had the sound of a child who had been promised pancakes and was monitoring the situation closely from a kitchen stool. It had the sound of Sophia at the counter, her hair down and unguarded in the way it only was on mornings when she wasn't working, telling Ellie about the different shapes pancakes could be: circle, star, the letter E. It had the sound of Ethan reading a request to flip one in the shape of a rabbit and agreeing, with full seriousness, that this was technically achievable. Sophia had not moved in. She had been very thoughtful about this, about what the right pace was, what was right for Ellie, what was right for herself. She had her studio apartment still, the coffee tin on the high shelf now containing the beginnings of enrollment fees for the childhood development certificate she'd registered for in September. She had her own life, with its own shape, and she had not let it dissolve into something else simply because something else had become available. But she was here most Saturday mornings. She was here for Sunday dinners. She was here in the way that matters, present, contributing the specific gravity of herself, which was, Ethan had come to understand, considerable. She did not float easily. She was a person of weight and substance and decided opinions, and he had learned that arguing with her was one of the most interesting things he did on any given day, and that losing an argument to her was, inexplicably, not unpleasant. He had told her about his mother, about the 18 months of sealed rooms and cold coffee, and the particular silence of grief that becomes habit. She had told him about her father, recovered now, calling every Sunday, his voice slightly rougher on the phone than it used to be, which she tried not to think about too hard. She had told him about the relationship before, not as a wound to exhibit, but as information, relevant context, the way she gave him everything, plainly, without performance. He had listened with his whole face. That was, she had decided, the thing about Ethan Hartwell. He listened with his whole face. She hadn't expected that. She had expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something more defended. Something that matched the scale of the house and the reputation and the Forbes articles. Instead, she'd gotten a man who sat on kitchen floors, who could not resist the gravitational pull of a determined toddler, who had written a note at midnight about sun catchers because he'd been thinking about her daughter, because thinking about her daughter had become the most natural thing in the world to him, without his permission, without fanfare, without any of the usual negotiations of a person deciding to care. He loved Ellie. She had watched it happen, had watched the accidental openness of a 3-year-old work on him like medicine, patient and insistent, until something that had been closed in him came open. She had seen men who claimed to love children and kept them at a careful distance. Ethan came toward Ellie. Every time, without being asked. This morning, the rabbit pancake was being evaluated by its recipient with great seriousness. "It has one ear too short," Ellie said. "That's how this rabbit was born," Ethan said. "Rabbits have same ears. This one doesn't." "Why?" "He had a very interesting life." Ellie appeared to find this acceptable. She bit the short ear first, in what seemed to be an act of mercy toward the asymmetrical rabbit, and chewed with philosophical thoroughness. Sophia, watching this exchange with her coffee held in both hands, still, always like it was warm and she needed the warmth, felt something she had learned over 6 months to stop being afraid of. It was the feeling she'd first noticed in the sunroom, that Tuesday in April, when she'd watched him crouch down to her daughter's level. She'd tried to file it and contain it and talk herself past it. She had failed comprehensively. The feeling was this: she was home, not the building. The house was extraordinary, but that was not what she meant. She meant the specific arrangement of people in this kitchen on this morning, her daughter with her rabbit pancake and her running commentary, this man with his willingness to defend the life choices of a fictional asymmetrical rabbit with a straight face, and Sophia herself, here, present, with her guard down and her hair loose and her future in a coffee tin and her heart in a state she'd stopped trying to manage. Ethan looked up from the pan and met her eyes across the kitchen island. He didn't say anything. He had learned that she didn't always need words. Sometimes she just needed to be seen, clearly and without condition, and he had gotten very good at this particular skill. She held his gaze and let herself be seen. Fully. The exhaustion and the resilience and the pride and the softness and the 3 years of single parenthood and the coffee tin dreams and the part of her that had almost given up on this exact thing, being looked at like she was worth looking at, and then hadn't. "Mama," said Ellie, holding up the denuded rabbit pancake. "His other ear is also delicious." "I'm glad," Sophia said, and her voice was soft and even and full of everything she'd learned to carry without it crushing her. "I'm really glad, baby." Ethan slid another pancake from the pan and set it on a plate, and the morning continued, and the sunlight came through the windows of the Hartwell estate at the same angle it always had, landing on the same floors and the same ceilings, but what it illuminated had changed. There was a shoebox on the lowest shelf. There was a child's laughter in the east corridor. There was coffee made in the right amount for the right number of people. And in the kitchen, where silence used to press down like a weight, there was the particular music of a life that had been, against all probability, found. Not built from the top, the way Ethan had always built things, not constructed with precision and capital and calculated risk. Found the way the best things are found, by accident, in a room full of morning light, when a small girl in yellow overalls held up a cherry lollipop and showed the world what it meant to offer everything you had without asking anything in return. He had been unable to look away. He never looked away again. And